When Anne woke up the next morning, she felt happy. She jumped out of bed and ran to the window. It was a beautiful morning. The sun shone and the sky was blue. Anne opened the window. Outside there was a fruit tree with beautiful flowers. Anne could see many other trees and flowers, and a small river, too. "This is a wonderful place," she thought. Then suddenly she remembered. She felt very sad again. "But I can't stay here," she thought. "They don't want me because I'm not a boy." Marilla came into the room. "Good morning, Anne," she said. "Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face and put on your clothes." "I'm feeling very hungry," Anne said. "I can never be sad in the mornings. I love mornings." After breakfast, Anne washed the plates and cups. Marilla watched carefully, but Anne did the job well. "This afternoon I'm going to drive to White Sands," Marilla said. "You'll come with me, Anne, and we'll talk to Mrs. Spencer." Matthew didn't say anything, but he looked very sad. Later he got the horse and buggy ready for Marilla. Marilla drove, and Anne sat next to her. "Is it a long way to White Sands?" asked Anne. "About 8 kilometers," answered Marilla. "I know you like to talk, Anne. So tell me your story." "It isn't very interesting," said Anne. "I was born in Bolingbroke in Nova Scotia, and I was 11 last March. My parents were teachers, but they died when I was a baby, so their cleaner, Mrs. Thomas, and her husband took me into their house. Mrs. Thomas had 4 children. I helped her with them, but then Mr. Thomas died in an accident. Mrs. Thomas and the children went to Mr. Thomas's parents. They didn't want me. Then Mrs. Hammond, Mrs. Thomas's friend, took me into her house. She had 8 children. They were very hard work. Then Mrs. Hammond moved away. I had to go to the orphanage because nobody wanted me. I was there for 4 months. "Did you go to school?" asked Marilla. "No, not often," answered Anne. "I didn't have time. I was always busy with the children. But I like reading very much." "Were these women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, kind to you?" asked Marilla. "They wanted to be kind," Anne said slowly, "but they were always very tired. They couldn't really be kind to me." Marilla suddenly felt very sorry for Anne. The little girl's life was very sad. Nobody wanted her or loved her. When Mrs. Spencer saw Marilla and Anne, she was very surprised. Marilla told her about the problem. "I'm very sorry," answered Mrs. Spencer. "I made a mistake. But I have an idea. My neighbor, Mrs. Blewett, has a new baby. She wants a girl to help her. Anne can go and live with her." "Oh," said Marilla. She knew about Mrs. Blewett. Mrs. Blewett had a lot of children, but she wasn't very kind to them. "Look," said Mrs. Spencer. "Here's Mrs. Blewett now." Mrs. Blewett had small, cold eyes. "This is Marilla Cuthbert from Green Gables," Mrs. Spencer told her. "And this little girl is from the orphanage. I brought her for Marilla, but Marilla wants a boy. Would you like her?" Mrs. Blewett looked at Anne for a long time. She didn't smile. "She's very thin," she said. "I hope she's strong. She'll have to work hard." "Yes, Mrs. Spencer. I'll take this girl. She can come home with me now." Marilla looked at Anne's unhappy face. "I can't give Anne to Mrs. Blewett," she thought. "Wait," she said. "First I have to discuss things with my brother, Matthew. He wants Anne to stay with us." Anne looked at Marilla in surprise. Then she jumped up and ran across the room. "Can I really stay with you at Green Gables?" she asked. "Did you really say that?" "I don't know," said Marilla. "Now sit down and be quiet." When Marilla and Anne arrived at Green Gables, Matthew met them. He was very happy when he saw Anne. Later, Marilla told him about Mrs. Blewett. She told him Anne's story, too. Matthew wasn't usually angry, but he was very angry about Mrs. Blewett. "That Blewett woman is very unkind," he said. "I know," said Marilla. "I don't like her. All right, Matthew. Anne can stay here with us. But I don't know very much about children. I hope I don't make any mistakes with her." "Thank you, Marilla," said Matthew happily. "Anne's a very interesting little girl. Be good to her. Then she'll always love you." Next day, Marilla didn't tell Anne about her conversation with Matthew. She gave Anne a lot of work in the kitchen. "Marilla," said Anne excitedly, "I have to know about my future. Please tell me. Are you going to send me away?" "No," said Marilla. "You can stay at Green Gables with Matthew and me, but you have to be good." Anne started to cry. "Why are you crying?" asked Marilla in surprise. "Don't you want to stay with us? Don't you like Green Gables?" "Oh, yes, Marilla," cried Anne. "I like it very much. I'm crying because I'm very happy. And I'll always be good." Some days later, Mrs. Lynde came to tea with Marilla. When she arrived, Anne was outside. Marilla and Mrs. Lynde sat in the kitchen and talked. "I think you're making a mistake," said Mrs. Lynde. "You don't know anything about children." "No, but I can learn," said Marilla. Anne ran into the kitchen. She saw Mrs. Lynde and stopped. "The Cuthberts didn't take you for your pretty face," Mrs. Lynde said. "She's very thin, Marilla, and her hair is as red as carrots. Come here, child. I want to see you." Anne ran across the kitchen and stood in front of Mrs. Lynde. Her face was red and angry. "I hate you," she cried. "I hate you! I hate you!" "Anne," cried Marilla. "You're a very rude woman," Anne told Mrs. Lynde. "And you're fat." "Anne, go to your room," said Marilla. "Wait for me there." Anne started to cry. Then she ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde got up from her chair. "I'm going home now, Marilla," she said. "That child is very wild. You'll have a lot of problems with her." "But you said unkind things about her," said Marilla. After Mrs. Lynde went home, Marilla went upstairs. Why did Anne say those things? She thought unhappily. Now Mrs. Lynde will tell everybody in Avonlea about her. "Stop crying and listen to me, Anne," she said. "You were very rude to Mrs. Lynde. She was a visitor in my home."
"But she was very unkind," said Anne.
"I want you to say sorry to Mrs. Lynde," said Marilla.
"Never," said Anne. "I'm not sorry."
Marilla remembered something. When she was a child, her aunts often talked about her. "Marilla isn't a very pretty little girl," they said. "Maybe Mrs. Lynde was unkind," said Marilla quietly, "but you have to say sorry. Stay here in your room." Next morning, Anne didn't come down to breakfast. Marilla told Matthew the story. "She was very rude," she said. "But Marilla," said Matthew, "Mrs. Lynde doesn't think before she speaks. Please don't be angry with Anne." Anne stayed in her room all day. Marilla took food upstairs, but Anne didn't eat very much. In the evening, Matthew went quietly up to Anne's room. Anne was on a chair by the window. She looked very small and unhappy. Matthew felt very sorry for her. He closed the door. "Please go and say sorry to Mrs. Lynde, Anne," he said.
"All right, Matthew," said Anne. "I wasn't sorry yesterday, but I'm sorry now. I'll do it because you asked me."
"Good," said Matthew happily. "It's very quiet downstairs without you, Anne." He went quietly out of the room. Later, Marilla and Anne walked to Mrs. Lynde's house.
"I'm very, very sorry, Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "I was very rude to you. You were right about my red hair, and I am thin and ugly."
Mrs. Lynde smiled. "I was rude to you, too," she said. "You do have red hair, but maybe it will change color when you're older."
"That's very kind of you, Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "Now I can hope for prettier hair. Please, can I go outside and play?"
"Yes, of course," said Mrs. Lynde. "Find some flowers." Anne went out and closed the door behind her. Anne is really sorry, thought Marilla. But she's funny, too. "She's a strange little girl," said Mrs. Lynde to Marilla. "But she isn't a bad child. I like her." On the way home, Anne suddenly put her small hand into Marilla's hand.
"I love Green Gables, Marilla," she said. "It's my home now."